Look at me, look right here, because what I'm about to walk you through is the loudest, ugliest, most humiliating faceplant hip-hop has watched in a decade, and it's happening in slow motion on every timeline you scroll. Rick Ross just dropped an album called Set in Stone, and the only thing set in stone right now is the tombstone the internet is already carving for him. Under 26K first week. Under 26K. That's the projection. That's not a rumor whispered in a group chat, that's the number circulating across every credible sales tracker, and 50 Cent was the first man in the building with a shovel. He didn't wait. He didn't warm up. He walked straight to the microphone of the internet and started throwing dirt on a career that used to sell out arenas. And listen, I've watched a lot of beefs in this game. I've covered a lot of collapses. I've seen legends stumble and I've seen legends rise from stumbles. But this one? This one has a smell to it. This one feels different. This one feels like the last page of a story Rick Ross wrote himself and refused to read out loud. So sit down, lock in, because we're about to dissect every single piece of this, the empty seats, the guest list that's outshining the host, the streaming numbers that read like a punchline, and the exact clip where 50 Cent essentially declared the war over. And I promise you, by the end of this, you're going to see why the whole hip-hop world is quietly whispering the same 3 words, it's finally over. Because when I tell you the receipts on this one are stacked higher than any moment in the entire 50 Cent vs. Rick Ross saga, I'm not exaggerating. I'm not embellishing. I'm not padding a headline for clicks. I'm telling you what the spreadsheets say, what the venues say, what the streaming dashboards say, and what the man himself, Curtis, has already started saying out loud with a grin that has been 20 years in the making. Let me set the table first, because context is everything when you're watching a giant fall. Rick Ross has been in the spotlight for weeks now, and not the good kind. He's been on every podcast, in every interview chair, throwing little comments at little targets, staying relevant the only way a certain kind of aging superstar knows how, by making noise. But watch this shift, because that noise didn't work this time. That noise didn't build anticipation. That noise didn't move units. And the second the pre-sale numbers for Set in Stone started leaking, everything Rick Ross had been trying to distract us from came into focus at once. The tour dates were the first tell. Miami, his own city, his own kingdom, his own supposed birthright, had venue shots leaking online showing rows and rows of empty seats stretching all the way to the back wall. Empty. Not sparse. Not modest. Empty. And when your home city won't come see you, that's not a marketing problem. That's a message. That's the audience voting with its wallet, and the wallet is closed. And if the wallet is closed in Miami, the city where Rick Ross built his myth, the city where he shot half his music videos, the city where his name is supposed to hang in the sky like a neon flag, then imagine what the wallet is doing in Atlanta, in Houston, in Los Angeles, in every secondary market where the Rozay brand doesn't get the hometown discount. The Miami shots weren't an anomaly. The Miami shots were the mildest version of the story. And 50 Cent, as always, was watching. You know how Curtis is. Curtis doesn't need to be invited. Curtis doesn't need a press release. Curtis lives in the notifications tab of every hip-hop headline that has Rick Ross' name attached to it. So the moment those Miami shots dropped, 50 Cent hopped on his page and started painting a picture that had the whole internet crying. He joked, and this is the joke that hit the loudest, that Rick Ross might have to start promoting car shows and selling chicken wings if the album keeps sliding at this pace. Chicken wings. Car shows. That's the kind of shot 50 Cent delivers because he understands something most of his peers never figured out. The deepest cut isn't the loudest insult. The deepest cut is the specific one. The one so precise it feels like it was written for the front of a t-shirt. And listen, I've been covering the 50 Cent vs. Rick Ross saga for nearly 2 decades now, and I can tell you with a straight face, 50 Cent has never missed a chance to twist that knife when the moment presented itself. This moment presented itself on a silver platter. This moment walked up to 50 Cent's front door, rang the bell, handed him a script, and said, "Here, do what you do best." And 50 Cent did exactly that, with the timing of a comedian who has been rehearsing this exact punchline for 20 summers. But before we go any deeper into what 50 Cent said, I want you to sit with the number one more time. Fewer than 26,000 units in a first week for an artist who once moved platinum plaques like grocery bags. Under 26K. For Rick Ross. For the man who called himself the biggest boss in the game. For the man who built Maybach Music Group with a straight face and told us all he was untouchable. Under 26K first week, a number nobody in his camp saw coming, and a number that could very realistically debut set in stone outside the Billboard 200's top 20 entirely. Read that back to yourself. Rick Ross. Outside the top 20. That's not a slump. That's a career-defining data point that every industry executive is looking at right now and quietly recalibrating what a Rick Ross album is even worth on the balance sheet. And that recalibration doesn't happen loudly. That recalibration happens in a boardroom, on a whiteboard, in a spreadsheet cell where somebody's advance for the next project gets a red line drawn through it. That's the part Rick Ross doesn't want you to focus on. That's the part 50 Cent has been circling like a shark since the first projection leaked. So how did we get here? Let me walk you through it, because the answer is layered, and it's ugly, and it's mostly about denial. Rick Ross has spent the last 5 years telling anyone with a microphone that he's still at the top of the mountain. He talks about his real estate. He talks about his cars. He talks about his lifestyle. He talks about everything except the one thing that used to matter, the music. And when the music finally arrives, it arrives packed. Packed with guests. Packed with features. Packed with names that were supposed to lift the numbers into the stratosphere. Rich the Kid. YFM Lucci. Don Toliver. Big X the Plug. The Dream. Big Tony. Nino Breeze. Gucci Mane. Kodak Black. Young Miami. That's the guest list. On paper, that's a lineup that should have set streaming platforms on fire. On paper. But paper doesn't stream. Paper doesn't buy tickets. Paper doesn't push a project into the top 10. And the actual streaming numbers are where the picture starts to crack wide open. And once that crack opens, you cannot unsee it. You cannot unhear it. You cannot unknow it. Because the streaming era does not forgive an album that was built like a magazine cover instead of a body of work. Only 2 songs on Set in Stone have crossed the 1 million stream threshold as of this recording. 2. Out of the entire track list. The record featuring T.I. is sitting at roughly 1.8 million streams. The collaboration featuring French Montana and Max B is sitting at around 4.4 million. Everything else on the album is trailing behind at a pace that would embarrass a rookie mixtape release. And here's the part that stings the most, a recent Drake single reportedly did more streams than Rick Ross' entire album combined. I'm going to say that one more time so it sits with you properly, a single Drake song moved more streams in a shorter window than the entire Rick Ross project has moved since it dropped. That's not a competitive gap. That's a canyon. That's the sound of an era ending, quietly, on servers where nobody is pressing play. That's what a legacy artist watches happen in real time when the culture has already moved on and nobody sent him the memo. That's not a slow decline. That's not a graceful fade. That's a public verdict being rendered on a public dashboard, and there is no appeal process available. And 50 Cent, of course, because it's him, pounced on that exact stat with the precision of a man who has been waiting years for this data to line up. He mentioned Kaizenit, he mentioned Aiden Ross, the streamer, and he twisted Ross' name into a punchline about streams, about relevance, about the gap between what Rick Ross tells the public and what the numbers actually confirm. And this is where the psychological game gets brutal, because 50 Cent isn't just clowning a competitor. 50 Cent is systematically reminding the audience that every single Rick Ross tantrum, every Rick Ross post, every Rick Ross radio drop over the last few weeks was ultimately a plea for attention on an album that wasn't ready to compete. Rick Ross campaigned harder for this album than for any project since Teflon Don, and the return on that campaign is under 26K. That math doesn't lie. That math doesn't spin. That math is the definition of set in stone. And the worst part, the part that keeps 50 Cent smiling, is that Rick Ross gave the album that title himself. He named the ceiling. He carved the epitaph. He handed 50 Cent the marker and stepped away from the wall. Now let's talk about the interviews, because Rick Ross has been giving them at a frequency that borders on desperate. He sits down, he laughs, he brushes off the beef with Drake, he brushes off the pressure, he talks about etching a legacy a little bit at a time. That's the framing he keeps returning to, that Set in Stone is about carving out something permanent, one move at a time. But when the interviewer asks him a direct question about the Drake situation, he sidesteps. When he's asked about the beef with 50 Cent, he sidesteps. When he's asked about anything that could actually generate genuine curiosity, he sidesteps and points back to his lifestyle. And the internet, because the internet is a merciless audience, clocked every single one of those sidesteps in real time. There's an interview clip circulating right now where Rick Ross literally cannot answer whether he's squashing the Drake beef, and the interviewer, mid-laugh, says the words every one of us was thinking, "I don't know what that means." That clip alone has more engagement than most of the singles from Set in Stone. Let that sit. Let that marinate. Let that live in your head the next time somebody tries to tell you Rick Ross is having a normal week. And then, because the internet was already sharpening the knives, 50 Cent pushed the story into an entirely new phase. He started asking, out loud, in his own voice, why Drake and Rick Ross, two of the most decorated collaborators of the last 15 years, aren't making music together anymore. He asked why the alley-oop and dunker duo has gone quiet. He asked, plainly, what happened to a partnership that used to print money? And that's a devastating question, because it forces the audience to compare the Rick Ross of 2015, who was untouchable on a hook alongside Drake, to the Rick Ross of today, who is projected to move under 26K first week on an album stuffed with features. The comparison is savage. The comparison is unspoken but inescapable. And 50 Cent knows exactly what he's doing when he plants that comparison in the ground and walks away smiling. Because comparisons are the deadliest weapons in hip-hop. Nobody survives a bad comparison. Nobody. And 50 Cent has been laying comparison traps for Rick Ross with the patience of a chess grandmaster stacking pieces 3 moves ahead. But watch this next shift, because it's the part of the story most casual observers are missing. Rick Ross' inner circle is starting to look thin. There have been reports of security failures. There have been public embarrassments involving his bodyguards. There have been moments where the mogul who used to project untouchable power has been photographed alone, on his own property, cutting his own grass. Now, and I want to be careful here, there is nothing wrong with a man cutting his own grass. There is nothing wrong with a man taking care of his own lawn. But context is everything in this business. Rick Ross has spent 20 years telling us he lives on a 100-acre estate with staff and helicopters and Rolls-Royces. When you build that image, when you sell that image, when you monetize that image on every album cover, on every music video, on every luxury brand name drop, the audience notices when you're the one pushing the mower. And 50 Cent noticed. 50 Cent noticed loudly. And the clip of him asking, on camera, why Rick Ross is cutting his own grass to save money has been screenshotted, remixed, and reposted so many times it has become a piece of internet folklore in its own right. A whole generation of hip-hop fans is going to remember this era of Rick Ross not for the bars, not for the hooks, not for the platinum records, but for the lawnmower. And that is a cultural sentence 50 Cent has just handed down with a smile. The tragedy of this moment, because that's what it is, a tragedy, is that Rick Ross keeps responding to it. He doesn't ignore. He doesn't rise above. He doesn't take the veteran route and let the noise pass. He gets on interviews and says, with a straight face, that he's a top-tier chess player. He calls himself a sex symbol. He calls himself the wealthiest boss in the business. And every one of those declarations, delivered in front of a microphone by a man whose album is projected to move under 26K, feels less like confidence and more like coping. And the internet, again, clocks it. The internet clocks every single line. The internet takes those declarations and stacks them next to the sales numbers and lets the juxtaposition do the work. Because that is what the modern audience does. It doesn't argue with you. It doesn't debate you. It simply screenshots you, side by side with your own contradictions, and lets the timeline sentence you. Rick Ross has been sentencing himself, one interview at a time, for months. And 50 Cent hasn't had to lift a finger to help. And meanwhile, 50 Cent doesn't have to say much. That's the genius of the position 50 Cent is in right now. He doesn't have to fabricate outrage. He doesn't have to invent a controversy. He simply has to point. He points at the empty seats. He points at the streaming numbers. He points at the projections. He points at Rick Ross' own words and lets them collapse under their own weight. He said it himself in a recent clip that's been making the rounds, nothing else works for Rick Ross outside of mentioning me. When things get bad, Rick Ross mentions 50 Cent. When the album flops, Rick Ross mentions 50 Cent. When the numbers dry up, Rick Ross mentions 50 Cent. Because 50 Cent is the last remaining lever Rick Ross knows how to pull to get coverage. And that's not a fan theory. That's not a hater's talking point. That's a pattern documented in nearly 2 decades of hip-hop headlines. Every time Rick Ross has felt himself slipping, Rick Ross has aimed at 50 Cent. And every time, 50 Cent has served him back the same medicine, but colder, sharper, and better timed. It's not even a rivalry anymore in the traditional sense. It's a feeding cycle. Rick Ross feeds 50 Cent content. 50 Cent turns that content into memes. The memes generate coverage. The coverage props up Rick Ross' relevance just long enough for him to feed 50 Cent again. And around the wheel spins, with only one man laughing at the end of every revolution. Which brings us to the question sitting in the middle of every hip-hop group chat this week: was the album actually any good? Because commercial performance is one thing, but taste is another. Music is subjective. Numbers aren't. And I'll be honest with you, I listened to Set in Stone front to back before I sat down to record this, because I wasn't going to give you a verdict I hadn't earned. And here's the truth. There are moments. There are flashes. There are bars sprinkled across the track list that remind you why Rick Ross was once considered one of the sharpest lyricists in the coke rap tradition. But those moments are buried. Those moments are outnumbered. Those moments feel like a man reaching backwards into his own catalog for muscle memory instead of building something new from scratch. And the beats, I have to say it, the beats feel curated by a checklist rather than by an ear. There is a difference between an album that sounds expensive and an album that sounds necessary. Set in Stone sounds expensive. Set in Stone does not sound necessary. And in 2026, the streaming algorithm does not reward expensive. The streaming algorithm rewards necessary. And Rick Ross has forgotten the difference. And the guests keep outshining the host. That's the pattern you can't unhear once you notice it. YFN Lucci comes in with more energy than the track deserves. Kodak Black shows up and reminds everyone why he's still one of the most magnetic voices in the South. Gucci Mane sleepwalks a verse and it still lands harder than the hook. Even Young Miami, who nobody expected to steal a scene, walks in and out of her feature with more personality than the man whose name is on the album cover. And that's the thing about stacking guests on a project: when the guests eat, they don't leave anything for the chef. Rick Ross packed the buffet, invited the whole city, and then couldn't find a plate for himself. He built the room. He set the menu. He paid for the catering. And then he sat at the end of the table watching his own dinner guests take turns being more interesting than him. That is not a bad night. That is a career diagnosis. And yet, hold that thought, because there's a broader industry story sitting underneath all of this that nobody is willing to say out loud. Rick Ross isn't the only veteran struggling to move units in the current climate. The album era is bleeding out. Streaming is fragmenting attention. Legacy artists are running into the same wall over and over. But, and this is the key qualifier, most of Rick Ross' peers aren't taunting the industry on the way down. Most of his peers aren't calling themselves untouchable in the same week their numbers embarrass them publicly. Most of his peers aren't inviting the comparison to their own peak. Rick Ross keeps inviting the comparison. Rick Ross keeps daring the audience to check his math. And when the audience checks his math, the math laughs. That's the difference between an aging artist who understands the moment and an aging artist who's fighting it. Jay-Z understands the moment. Nas understands the moment. Even Eminem, love him or hate him, has learned how to release without demanding the throne. Rick Ross is still demanding the throne while sitting on a folding chair, and everybody except Rick Ross can see the folding chair. That's why 50 Cent's role in this story matters so much. 50 Cent isn't just the antagonist here. 50 Cent is the auditor. 50 Cent is the industry's unpaid fact checker. When Rick Ross claims a number, 50 Cent posts the receipts. When Rick Ross claims a tour, 50 Cent posts the venue shots. When Rick Ross claims relevance, 50 Cent quietly reminds the audience how few singles have crossed the streaming threshold. And the audience, the modern hip-hop audience, which is younger, faster, and less patient than any generation of listeners before, rewards receipts. The audience rewards receipts every time. It's why 50 Cent's Instagram engagement dwarfs almost every rapper his age. It's why his television empire keeps expanding. It's why every time a legacy rapper has a bad week, 50 Cent's phone starts ringing. He built a brand around being the loudest, funniest, most efficient documenter of hip-hop's collapse points, and Rick Ross has been feeding him ammunition for years. Ammunition Rick Ross keeps handing over with a smile, like he doesn't understand that the man across from him is loading the very rounds that get fired into his own reputation the following week. Now let me pivot to something a lot of people have been asking me about privately, because it deserves its own beat. What does Def Jam do with this? What does the label do with a legacy artist whose first week is projected under 26K? Because that's a math problem the label has to solve. Marketing budgets have to be justified. Radio pushes have to be reevaluated. Sync licensing has to be reconsidered. And if you're an executive at a major label right now, you're looking at Set in Stone and asking a very cold, very unsentimental question: is this a one-time miss or is this the new baseline? Because if this is the new baseline, the entire model of investing in a legacy Rick Ross album has to be rewritten. And that's the kind of conversation that happens behind closed doors, in corner offices, without press releases, until suddenly one day the artist finds out their next project has a smaller advance than they were expecting. That's the industry. That's how the industry moves. Rick Ross has been in the game long enough to know it. He wrote the playbook on how to leverage a label into a favorable position, and now that same playbook is being read back to him by a room full of executives who no longer see him as the alpha in the deal. And here's where 50 Cent's psychological warfare hits its most surgical note. 50 Cent isn't just aiming at Rick Ross. 50 Cent is aiming at Rick Ross leverage. Because leverage in the music industry is perception. Leverage is the belief that you can still deliver a hit if the label pushes hard enough. Leverage is the belief that your name still moves units. Leverage is the belief that your feature is worth a $100,000 check. And every time 50 Cent posts, every time 50 Cent laughs, every time 50 Cent points at the empty seats and the streaming shortfalls, he chips a little more of that leverage away. He's not fighting Rick Ross with insults. He's fighting Rick Ross with erosion. And erosion, in this business, is the deadliest weapon there is. You can survive a diss track. You can survive a bad interview. You can survive a viral clip. You cannot survive being quietly repriced by the very system that used to prop you up. And Rick Ross is being repriced in real time, without a press release, in every conversation happening right now behind the walls of a major label boardroom. I want to zoom in for a second on one specific line from a recent 50 Cent moment, because it captures the entire dynamic in a single breath. He said, essentially, that Rick Ross' whole career at this stage has been based on generating attention through him, that Rick Ross' relevance heading deeper into 2026 is downstream of the beef. That's a devastating claim. It's a claim that says, without me, you're invisible. And whether it's true or not, whether Rick Ross would still have a career without the 50 Cent beef or not, is almost beside the point. The claim itself is the damage. Because now every headline about Rick Ross has to be filtered through that claim. Now every interview Rick Ross gives has to defend itself against that claim. Now every album Rick Ross drops has to sell against that claim. And the moment an artist has to sell against a claim, they've already lost the framing battle. The framing battle is the war, and 50 Cent won it before Set in Stone even hit streaming platforms. But watch this next flip, and this is the part that separates seasoned observers from casual ones. 50 Cent has done this exact play before. He did it to Ja Rule. He did it to Fat Joe. He did it, in a different key, to Kanye West in the album release week arena. He has a playbook, refined over 20 years, for turning a competitor's release week into a public autopsy. And the playbook works because 50 Cent understands the modern attention economy better than almost anyone in his generation. He understands memes. He understands screenshot culture. He understands the exact ratio of comedy to cruelty that keeps a post going viral without crossing into liability. And he understands, most importantly, that in 2026, the artist who wins the release week is not the artist with the best album, it's the artist with the loudest narrative. And right now, the loudest narrative around Set in Stone is not the music. It's the flop. And the man authoring that narrative, one Instagram post at a time, is 50 Cent. The album isn't competing with itself for attention. The album isn't competing with Drake or Kendrick or Future. The album is competing with the meme cycle 50 Cent has already built around it. And that is a fight no album, from any artist, has ever won. Drop your verdict below. I'm reading every single one, because I want to know, is Rick Ross cooked, or is there a comeback in him? Because that's the debate splitting the timeline in half right now. On one side, you have listeners who believe Rick Ross' era is officially over, that the numbers have spoken, that no amount of interview clips and lifestyle posts can undo a sub 26K first week. On the other side, you have loyalists who insist Rick Ross is a lifer, that he has always played the long game, that Set in Stone is one project in a career of legendary projects, and that writing him off now is premature. Both camps have a point. Both camps have data. And I'm not going to tell you which camp is right, because that's your job in the comments right now. Tell me. Argue it out. Cite your sources. Show your work. Because the beauty of this moment in hip-hop is that we, the audience, get to be the jury for the first time in a real way, and the verdict we render in the comment sections is going to matter more than any Billboard chart position by the time this decade closes out. Let me tell you what I do know. Rick Ross is not the same Rick Ross of 2010. Rick Ross is not the same Rick Ross of Teflon Don. Rick Ross is not the same Rick Ross of God Forgives, I Don't. The confidence is still there. The bravado is still there. The mustache and the medallion and the mansion are still there. But something has slipped underneath the surface, and everybody who has been paying attention can hear it. His flows have gotten more predictable. His hooks have gotten less sticky. His guest choices feel more calculated than creative. And even his interview cadence, the thing that used to make him one of the most watchable characters in the entire genre, has started to sound rehearsed, like a man reading from a document he hasn't updated in 5 years. The Rick Ross of 2010 improvised. The Rick Ross of 2026 recites. And the audience, no matter how loyal, can always tell the difference between an artist who is discovering something in front of us and an artist who is repeating something for us. Rick Ross is repeating. 50 Cent, on the other hand, is still discovering new punchlines, new angles, new ways to build a viral moment out of somebody else's bad week. And 50 Cent, meanwhile, has been evolving in the exact opposite direction. He has expanded. He has diversified. He has built an empire outside of music that generates more revenue in a quarter than most rappers see in a decade. He has television. He has liquor. He has fitness. He has book deals. He has a boxing promotion. He has streaming partnerships. He has become, quietly, one of the most impressive business case studies in the entire hip-hop economy, while still finding time, on any given Tuesday, to bury a rival with a single caption. That's the asymmetry. That's the imbalance that makes this beef so lopsided in 2026. Rick Ross is fighting for the top of the rap charts. 50 Cent is fighting for the top of the Forbes list. They're not even in the same weight class anymore, and yet Rick Ross keeps stepping into the ring anyway, because he doesn't know how not to. And that is the tragedy underneath the comedy. That is the part that isn't funny once you sit with it. A man who used to be one of the sharpest strategists in the culture has become a man who no longer knows when to sit down. And 50 Cent, without saying a single cruel word, keeps handing him another chair to trip over. There's a phrase you're going to hear a lot in the next few weeks, and I want you to remember where you heard it first: relevance debt. Relevance debt is when an artist has been coasting on legacy so long that when a bad week hits, the debt comes due all at once. Rick Ross has been accumulating relevance debt for years. Every skipped release. Every mediocre feature. Every distracted interview. Every social media flex that didn't move the culture forward. It all added up quietly, and set in stone is the moment the ledger got settled. Under 26K. Empty arenas. A streaming album where a single Drake song beats the entire track list. That's what relevance debt looks like when the collector finally knocks on the door. And nobody knocks louder than 50 Cent. Relevance debt is what happens when you spend more time defending your position than earning it. Rick Ross spent years defending his position. 50 Cent spent those same years building new positions in new industries. That is the entire ballgame in a single sentence, and Rick Ross is the only person in the arena who hasn't finished reading the scoreboard. Now, I want to be fair to Rick Ross, because fairness matters even in a story this brutal. He is still one of the most influential figures in modern Southern hip-hop. He is still responsible for launching a generation of Miami artists. He is still the architect of Maybach Music Group, which at its peak was one of the sharpest label rosters in the industry. He signed Meek Mill. He signed Whale. He signed Stally. He put people on. And nothing 50 Cent says, nothing the timeline says, nothing the streaming numbers say, can erase that history. But history doesn't pay this week's bills. History doesn't fill this week's arenas. And history doesn't stop 50 Cent from posting screenshots of your first week projection with a laughing emoji at 3 in the morning. That is the brutal calculus of legacy in the streaming age. You can be historically important and commercially expendable in the same breath. Rick Ross is discovering that calculus for the first time in his career, and the audience is watching him discover it live, without a filter, without a buffer, without a spin doctor able to soften the arithmetic. There's a moment in a recent Rick Ross interview that I want to close on, because it might be the single most revealing beat in the entire cycle. He was asked, casually, whether he still enjoys making music. And he said yes. He said he loves it. He said he loves the interviews. He said he loves the vibes. He said he loves the DJs. He said he does it because he loves the game. And I believed him when he said it. I believed him because you could hear it in his voice. But love and market performance are two different things. Love and streaming numbers are two different things. Love and first week sales are two different things. Rick Ross can love the game every single day of his life, and the market can still turn its back on him quietly, respectfully, and completely. That's what's happening right now. The market isn't screaming at Rick Ross. The market isn't booing Rick Ross. The market is simply, softly, no longer buying tickets. And that silence is louder than any diss track 50 Cent could ever produce. Silence is the sound of an era ending. Silence is the sound of a culture moving on. Silence is the sound 50 Cent has been waiting 20 years to hear surrounding a Rick Ross release week, and this week, finally, silence is exactly what he got, the deafening, undeniable, spreadsheet-verified silence of a market that has decided, without a vote, without a debate, without a press conference, that it's ready to hand the microphone to somebody else. So let me tie this off. Set in Stone will debut this week with numbers that will be studied by industry analysts for months. 50 Cent will keep posting. Rick Ross will keep responding. The timeline will keep laughing. And somewhere in the background, a generation of younger artists, the artists Rick Ross once helped put on, will quietly take note of what happens when a legacy career refuses to evolve. That's the lesson underneath this whole story. That's the lesson underneath the number. That's the lesson underneath the empty Miami arena. Adapt or become the punchline. Rick Ross knew the rules. Rick Ross wrote some of the rules. And Rick Ross, right now, in this exact week of his career, is standing on the wrong side of the rules he helped write. Every artist Rick Ross ever mentored is watching this moment and learning from it, because this is the moment their old mentor became the cautionary tale their careers will now be measured against. That lesson outlasts the album. 50 Cent doesn't need a diss record to finish this beef. 50 Cent doesn't need a studio session. 50 Cent doesn't need to open his mouth again. The numbers are doing the work. The projections are doing the work. The empty seats and the streaming shortfalls and the guest list that outshone the host, they're all doing the work. And 50 Cent gets to sit back, sip whatever he's sipping, and watch a 2-decade rivalry resolve itself in a spreadsheet. That is the cleanest victory 50 Cent has ever won in this feud, because it required nothing of him except patience. He didn't have to record a track. He didn't have to buy a billboard. He didn't have to stage a stunt. He just had to outlive Rick Ross' business model, and this week, he did exactly that, quietly, elegantly, and with a caption that will echo through hip-hop group chats until New Year's Eve. Here's my question for you as we wrap this up, and I want a real answer in the comments. No gatekeeping, no fake diplomacy, just the truth. Do you think Set in Stone is the final chapter of Rick Ross' commercial run, or is this the setup for a comeback the industry hasn't priced in yet? Because history has a funny habit of proving both sides wrong at the wrong time. And whether you're a Rick Ross loyalist since hustlin' or a 50 Cent partisan since get rich or die tryin', you have a stake in the answer. So drop it below. Tag a friend who's been ignoring this story. And if you made it this far, you already know I'm going to be back with a full breakdown the moment the official first week numbers post, because there's a version of this story